Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
You know, it's amazing, again, that somebody so ignorant of the very basics of economics can possess a Nobel Prize in that discipline. Again, it's more, I think, of a testament to the worthlessness of the prize and the ineptitude of the committee that awards it than maybe it is to Paul Krugman. But let me continue to play Paul Krugman talking about, you know, tax rates of as high as 80%, and how, in his mind, that would not be disruptive to the economy, and the government would just collect more revenue. This continues. Let me skip to cut number 13.
So back to the rates of the 50s, 60s.
That's right. Which is not going to happen, right? But moving in that direction, certainly not where we are right now.
That would astound a lot of people, I think, to think that if you could tax high-income people at 70 to 80%, that you would not have some sort of an erosion in revenues or increase in avoidance.
Well, no, you would have an increase in avoidance, but the question is how much. And remember that when you're raising the tax rate on people, so they have to do a lot of avoidance for that avoidance to more than to offset the fact that you are collecting more money on the stuff that you can catch.
Yes. First of all, when Paul Krugman says we're not going to get back to 80%, it's not that he doesn't want to go to 80%. He probably does. He just doesn't think it's politically possible to get the rates up that high, so he's probably lamenting that fact. But he does think it's going to get higher. But listen to this discussion about a 70 or 80% tax rate. Instead of saying how preposterous that is, Paul Krugman says, no, it's still okay. He acknowledges that there will be some tax avoidance, but he assumes that the government will generate more revenue because they'll get a lot more on the income they do tax than what they give up on what's avoided. And let's assume that somebody is able to cut their income in half through tax avoidance, and then the government taxes 80% of the half that's left. I suppose the government would generate more income than if the taxes were only 30% and they got 30% of 100%, because 80% of 50% is bigger than 30% of 100%. But what is the impact on the economy of somebody reducing their income by 50% in order to lower their taxes? Well, it's profound, because now they're not investing as much. Maybe they shut down some of their businesses, so they don't hire as many people. They fire people. So maybe the government would, in fact, collect more money from the rich with an 80% tax rate, but they would collect less money overall because the rich wouldn't employ as many people, and so their workers wouldn't pay as much taxes. You wouldn't have as efficient an economy. We wouldn't be producing as much. So tax revenue would fall in other parts of the economy. So Paul Krugman is wrong. Even if some rich people did end up paying more, the government would pay less. And, of course, a lot of rich people wouldn't pay more. They wouldn't pay any. They would reduce their income to zero because they would either leave the country or sell their businesses and not work at all. And so it would be a disaster. Now, of course, Krugman tries to pretend that, well, the 50s was good, and therefore it wasn't, the high tax rates aren't a barrier to growth. We're going to get to that cut in a minute. But first, on avoidance, listen to this little discussion with respect to the French and Gérard Depardieu. This is cut number 14.
Like Gérard Depardieu in France, for instance. 75% rate, and he's taking it to Russia.
Has he actually moved yet, though, right? My understanding is there's a lot more talk about moving to other places than there is actual movement. No, and look, we have a lot of experience. there have been, over the years, certainly in the United States, we've had tax rates on the rich that have varied a lot over time. And so we're not flying blind here. We have a lot of evidence on what actually happens. And
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, to say that he hasn't already moved yet as if he's not going to do it or as if people don't move. We already know that wealthy people move. They move from state to state. They do move from country to country. I am a perfect example. I've already mentioned on this show that we are moving an entire business. Euro Pacific Asset Management is moving to Puerto Rico. Now, before I was going to move to Puerto Rico, I was already planning on moving to either Singapore or Ireland or some other offshore city. So I was moving that business out of the country anyway to escape not only high taxes but high regulation. But now I'm going to move to Puerto Rico. But the move is entirely, the move to Puerto Rico really, is being motivated more by taxes than by regulation, because I'm still going to be subjected to regulations, U.S. security regulations, by operating out of Puerto Rico. But what I will free myself from are these confiscatory taxes that Paul Krugman says has no impact. And so that is going to impact because people are leaving California. My employees are leaving California. We're going to be hiring new people to grow Euro Pacific Asset Management, but we're not going to be hiring them in California anymore. We're going to be hiring them in Puerto Rico. And so Puerto Rico will benefit from their lower taxes. California and the United States in general will suffer from higher taxes. Let me play this one more clip before we take a break and then go to our guest who we have located. This one is on Paul Krugman talking about the 1950s and why high taxes didn't hurt the economy then. Have a listen. It's cut number 15.
Again, something the other side, if I can put it that way, says you remove incentive when you take away financial reward. You erode the value of work, those kinds of criticisms.
Again, I'm a card-carrying economist, so I have to believe that incentives matter. And they do matter, but the question is how much do they matter in this range? And look, in the United States, we went through a long period, a quarter century after World War II, with top tax rates that were way higher than they are now. In fact, way higher than anybody would consider proposing right now. And yet that was also the most successful generation of economic growth in our country's history.
Well, apparently not only does Paul Krugman not understand economics, he doesn't understand American history. The 1950s was not the most successful generation of economic growth in our history. Not even close. It's not even in the ballpark. If you really want to look at where we had the best economic growth, it was during the time after the Civil War and before the Federal Reserve. It was a time where we had no income tax whatsoever. That is where we had the most economic growth. Now, the 1950s would have been a much more prosperous decade had we not had the tax code that we did. But the only reason that the country didn't implode with a top tax rate of 80% was because the tax code had so many holes in it that it was so easy for businesses to avoid paying the 80% tax, and hardly anybody did. Most people paid a marginal rate of tax back then that is lower than the marginal rate of tax that I am paying right now because there were so many ways to avoid the tax, and we didn't have the type of tax code today that differentiates between all sorts of income. It was very easy to shelter your income. It was very easy to reduce your taxable income. And in fact, it was much easier for people to cheat. And there was a lot more cheating back then because they didn't have the 1099s. They didn't have the computers. It was harder for the IRS to know what was going on. There was a lot more cash in the economy, not as much credit cards. So there was a bigger underground economy, and there was a lot more tax avoidance going on. Thank God. Because if people had been dumb enough to turn over 80% of what they produced to the government, we wouldn't have produced very much, and the 50s would have been a huge disaster. Instead, we got through them, but nowhere near as robustly as Paul Krugman. And any success we had in the 1950s came despite those high tax rates, not because of it.